George, not too long ago, Tori wrote a blog which was called "We're Going to Need a Bigger Boat," and I think for people that are familiar with the movie Jaws, I think that was they would know that Tori wasn't talking about fishing or anything like that. Tori, you want to talk about your bigger boat?
Bigger boat theory. Well, as you said, it's a reference to the movie Jaws, where, at some point, Sheriff Brody, after coming face to face with the shark, turns around to Captain Quint and says, in deadpans, literally to the screen, "You're going to need a bigger boat." And I pair this up with a discussion about revenues. The message behind the blog was pretty simple. In order to pay for all of the things that taxpayers want from their federal government, including a robust social safety net, Social Security, Medicare, that exists in perpetuity, without making any cuts to any of these things, because nobody wants to cut Social Security, nobody wants to cut Medicare. We're going to need more revenue. I mean, we're already running, we have huge amounts of debt, $31 trillion in debt, 100% of GDP is our debt. We're running deficits every year of $1 trillion as far as the eye can see. We're gonna need more revenue. Okay. That's just simple arithmetic. This isn't even calculus. This is basic adding and subtracting from first and second grade. And I know that there are a lot of common myths out there that, we can solve this problem just by eliminating foreign aid, which, by the way, is less than 1% of our budget, or we can just tax the wealthy. Hint, hint, there's not enough money there. So we're going to need more revenue. So my question to you, George, is, are there sources of revenue out there, whether it's tax increases like a carbon tax or a VAT tax, or things that we can investigate on the tax expenditure side? For example, there are a lot of things that we don't tax that are excluded, from our tax bill, like the money that we pay for our health insurance premiums, et cetera. Are there sources of revenue out there that we can go to that are least harmful in terms of economic growth and are least distortive in terms of the economic decisions that people make? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really great question that people rack their brains over. I mean, we are, I think of these kinds of questions in the context of like a bipartisan grand bargain on deficit reduction. Our current trend lines, as you guys know, are so far away from like what is fiscally sustainable, that the effort to close that gap is going to require huge changes that are just going both from a math perspective and from a political perspective, are going to have to occur on both the tax and spending sides. More revenues, less spending. And it's going to have to be, I think, almost certainly going to have to be bipartisan and involve both sides of the budget ledger. So, in that context, the question becomes, well, what's the best way to get the stuff on the revenue side of the ledger, putting aside like entitlement reform and that kind of thing. And as you suggested, Tori, I think there may be some combination of base broadening, going after tax expenditures, tax breaks that exist, and plugging those holes. I tend to go there first, because I think those tax expenditures usually, not always, but usually represent economic distortions, and pick winners and losers, and getting rid of them is, even though it counts as an increase in taxes, you're really cutting a subsidy in most cases. That's what you're effectively doing, even though it shows up on the ledger as more tax payments, right? But economically, it's equivalent to cutting a government spending. So I tend to like to look there first. I also think it's probably politically easier, not politically easy, but politically easier to do than creating a brand new tax that doesn't currently exist, like a carbon tax or a value-added tax or a wealth tax, although that's almost certainly unconstitutional, that last one. People talk about a carbon tax. From a policy perspective, I find a carbon tax very interesting thing. The problems I have with the carbon tax from a sort of a fiscal perspective are, number one, if it actually achieves its climate related policy goals, the revenue from it will diminish over time as we move towards a lower or even zero carbon economy. In theory, it'll actually go away. It'll go to zero because we'll stop using fossil fuels completely. Now that's the theory, but it is sort of a diminishing tax if it effectively changes people's behavior in the way expected. The other issue is carbon tax discussions. In carbon tax discussions, the revenue seems it's almost always spoken for, right? That people have a carbon tax proposal that also gives out the revenue that's being brought in some form. So it's deficit neutral, but it's not a deficit reducer. And that's to compensate the losers for higher energy prices, right? And people have proposed different ways to do it. There's tax and dividend. There's people who want to give it out to maybe part of it to the producers if the case is made that the fossil fuel industry needs to be compensated. I mean, there's different ways to give it out, but everybody always has a way to give the revenue back out. And so they don't really think, they think of it as climate policy, not fiscal policy so much. Some kind of consumption tax, whether it's a credit invoice VAT like most of the world has, or a small retail sales tax, or some kind of cash flow consumption tax, which some have been involved in, like myself in the past.
Destination-based cash flow.
A destination-based cash flow tax, or some people call it a business consumption tax. I think those are interesting ideas that can be more or less economically damaging, I should say, than other types of taxes like taxes on income, taxes on investment, taxes on labor. But those are very hard to do because it's hard to create it politically, very difficult to create a brand new tax that doesn't exist. I've always said we'll get a VAT when there's a crisis and the bond markets are going to collapse if we don't do something fast. But we're not going to get it in like a thoughtful, deliberative environment.